Hello people, my name is Liam, also known as Millennial Model Mayhem. Today I am hand painting a gunpla kitbash project that has gone through many revisions over the past year, with plenty of twists and turns that I did not see coming, but I'm sure glad they did. Leave a comment right now if you think you already know what the color scheme inspiration is based off what you saw in the thumbnail. Now, allow me to regale you with the saga of my iron-blooded leftovers. This kitbash originally started as a way to utilize all the leftover pieces I'd been accumulating from various high-grade iron-blooded Orphans models over the years. Technically speaking, it comprises parts from
the high-grade Carta's Gray's Ritter, the high-grade McGillis's Schwalbe Grays, the real-grade Ava Unit 2, the high-grade Viate Suivant and Mercurius Suivant, the high-grade Gundam Astaroth, the master-grade Gundam Heavy Arms Endless Waltz version, the full mechanics Gundam Vidar, the master-grade Barbatos, the high-grade Gundam Gushin Rebake Full City.
If you've watched any of my previous videos, you likely already know that I greatly enjoy the Iron-Blooded Orphans mecha designs, and have praised the kitbash ability of this series in other projects. In the spring of 2023, I made a video specifically about kitbashing, involving both miniatures and gunpla, and I took a curated pile of Iron-Blooded Orphans leftovers and managed to transform it into this janky, claw-handed mecha. As satisfied as I was with the kitbashing I did in that video last year, I knew in my gut that there was some room for improvement, like how the shoulders needed some filling out and just the overall look of the mecha didn't look consistent enough for me. Thankfully, I had a
high-grade McGillis's Schwalbe Grays,
and I absolutely adore the elegant high-heeled legs of the Grays frame, so I set up a special kitbashing livestream earlier this year and refined the leftovers kitbash into something I deemed worthy of painting. The main changes I made were to utilize the head, legs, and waist boosters from the Greys, but also, just like I did with the Master Grade Buster Gundam, I turned these waist boosters into arm-mounted shield blades. Other than the heavy utilization of that Greys model, the other revisions I made were to fill out some of the lacking areas on the shoulders, and add parts of the missile pods from the Master Grade Heavy Arms Endless Waltz version to where the waist boosters used to be. After making these changes, I was much more satisfied with the overall look. Still nice and janky, well deserving of the Iron-Blooded Leftovers name, but with a more clearly defined look as a fast-moving machine ready to jet across the battlefield among a swarm of rockets, all while brandishing razor-sharp arm blades. Speaking of battlefields, like with the majority of my painted gunpla, I am customizing this model to be used for tabletop wargaming purposes, which involves mounting it on a base with arc markings, and mostly gluing the pose in place for ease of handling. Not to mention reducing the risk of damaging the fragile acrylic paint I use when hand painting. The base I used here was a 100mm circle from Games Workshop that I glued hand-cut plastic art on top of due to the textured surface. You may notice the base for this project has a bit of a different look from the previous blue bases of the Gushin and Ariel projects, and that's because I want these leftovers to have a different look entirely and act as a kind of elite mercenary that shows no affiliation to a particular crew. Also, the armor panels on these leftovers are a bit more edgy and angular, which doesn't quite fit the vibe for the freehand style painting I did on those two previous projects. Like with the previous filigreed projects though, the head will remain articulated, so it can be turned to utilize the quadrant markings in different ways, depending on which war game you're going to be playing, like Gamma Wolves. There's an aspect of any kitbash where having all the mixed colors and designs from different kits looks kinda bad, but then once you put a coat of primer on, everything looks greater than the sum of their parts. Speaking of primer, to start the painting off, I'm using good old reliable Vallejo black surface primer for everything, and I'm obviously using the airbrush here, but these stages can technically be done with hand painting if you don't have your own setup. A smoother result is just easier and more efficient to achieve if you're able to airbrush the paints. Next, the underframe is getting absolutely blasted with thinned down Vallejo model color Old Gold, same underframe color as the Ariel, even though this model will be in a different crew. I just wanted to use the gold again for one of the key color accents of the scheme I have planned. Then, because I have a hard time not using shifter paint on every project, I'm giving the gaps in between the plastic art on the base a solid blast of silver pink shifter paint that will hopefully complement the main color scheme without being too distracting. To finish off the metallic sections, I mix in some classic Citadel Mithril Silver into the old gold for a fairly aggressive dry brush to emphasize the details, followed by a sepia wash to fill in all the recesses, except this time I was feeling a little experimental and thought, why not mix in some of the golden shifter paint into the wash itself and see if I can add a little bit of extra flair with a kind of metallic glaze. How do you think it turned out, dearest viewer?
I love gold!
The gradients I painted on the previously mentioned blue bases flowed in an outward-inward direction, and since this one is different, I thought I'd go for a rotational flow instead. So I got to laying down the base coats with my custom mix as the dark side, Xeris purple in the middle, and a roughly 50-50 mix of Xeris and alien purple on the bright end. After the base coats and some initial wet blending had laid the pattern before me, I was noticing a lot of undesirable textures across the flat surface, which I think was mostly due to the Xeris purple being a little chunky and almost empty. Perhaps I could have thinned my paint down a bit more as well. This was an easy problem to fix with some 2,000 to 8,000 grit sanding sponges to smooth out that surface, followed by a final pass of blending using a lot more glaze medium. The texture was basically gone by the end, but there were still some obvious brush strokes. However, the more I hand paint models, the more I've grown to appreciate the painterly look of some obvious brush strokes. To finish off the base, I painted on basic edge highlights on the quadrant borders that roughly mimicked the direction of the gradients, with the brightest parts being almost pure alien purple at the corners. With the metallics and base gradients completed, it's time to get the foundational layers for the armor panels applied. Starting with the darkest, I'm going back to the black surface primer, which when hand-painted needs at least 2 coats for a solid layer. And like with most of my hand-painted gunpla, black is only one of the minor complementary parts of the scheme, so I'm only painting the areas with smaller amounts of flat surfaces that will involve the most in-depth edge highlighting later on. Next, I'm using P3 Iron Hull Gray as the most prominent armor color, so this is getting applied to the majority of large surfaces, with a few panels that neighbor both the gray and black being reserved for the final element of the color scheme. That element is Vallejo model color Medium Sea Gray that I've mixed with a few drops of golden high flow titanium white into to bring up the brightness just a bit and increase the contrast between the other gray. The plan is to have the brightest tone read as white, so I'm thinking this really bright gray will be an appropriate base to build up from. Most of my past projects have had very vibrant and colorful armor panels, so it was neat diverging from that a bit with this project by having all but the underframe be just blacks, grays, and whites. However, the eyes, thrusters, and arm blades are getting a base coat of the same purples used on the base. Then I went just a bit ahead of myself to do some initial edge highlighting on the blades with straight up Xeris purple. And with the overall look of this subdued gray armor, all of these purples are going to stand out that much more. While I'm taking my time applying the paint for this section, here is the Gamma Wolf's loadout I cooked up in case anyone was curious. I loaded it up with plenty of offensive power and extra armor that makes it pretty ineffective at taking on the extra weight from picking up salvage objectives, but that's okay because the grunt work can be delegated to the lesser pilots of the crew. The only thing that the iron-blooded leftovers care about is raw damage. If you enjoyed this video and would like to support my work for free, I encourage you to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already done so. And if you want to greatly help and encourage me, please consider making a donation at patreon.com/millennialmodelmayhem. Doing so will get you some exclusive benefits like behind-the-scenes updates, early access, and more. You could even join the Model Mayhem machines with Doodle, Bopped, and Moosepelheim, or the legendary Gogg hand with Country Fried Minis, Janel, and TsukasaWM. There's a new vlog up there right now, actually, where I talk about the recent Otafest gunpla competition that I participated in, as well as some exciting projects that I'm going to be working on after this video. After all the base coats are done, I move right on to the initial edge highlighting. Typically, I would glue at least the legs and waist down to the base at this point for better handling throughout the upcoming hand painting, but I'm planning on applying Waterslide decals near the end of the process, and I know those will be easier to do if I keep the model in sub-assemblies up until the very end. The black edge highlights are applied with a roughly 50-50 mix with the Iron Hull Gray, and for the mid-gray sections it's the same mix with Iron Hull and medium sea gray. Then I repeat that for the light gray sections with titanium white. These first edge highlights are meant to be fairly thick and will emphasize the borders between the shades, thus making them easier to pick out for the more refined highlights coming up soon. And with all that initial edge highlighting completed, I'm moving right along to the progressively smaller lines. The first of the thinner lines that go within the thick lines are applied across all but the most recessed and shaded areas, and for the second pass of an even thinner line, I start to selectively apply it only to the edges that would in theory be catching the light from above. There isn't much to say in regards to the mix of paints used here because it just goes along the logical progression of dark to light, and at this point the wet palette is getting pretty sloppy, so I'm really just eyeballing the mixes, reactivating what's already down there with water, and adding more paint as needed. The most important part to keep in mind when applying the third pass of highlights, which are mostly contained to the corners and top edges, is to keep the black highlight around a pure Iron Hull Gray, then that Iron Hull Gray's highlight to roughly pure medium sea gray, and finally the light gray receives a final edge highlight of pure titanium white. I enjoyed the challenge of doing all my usual edge highlights across a grayscale gradient like this. It felt familiar yet different from my usual color mixing, and I feel like this is the messiest my wet palette has ever gotten. Hard to say though, it usually gets pretty messy. When the armor edge highlights are finished, the last sections to hand paint are the glowing eyes, thrusters, and arm blades. The eyes and thrusters got a base coat of alien purple, and the next step was to build up a quick gradient to almost pure white, and then heavily dilute Xeris purple with the glaze medium to coat the entire surface, as well as the surrounding area to simulate the emanating glow. If it gets applied a bit too strongly, I either act fast enough to wipe away the excess, or reactivate some of the gray off the palette to do a kind of counter glaze to bring the purple back a bit. The arm blade edge highlights have a bit more effort put into them by building up a gradient involving the Xeris purple and making sure that the final white edges are nice and crispy to simulate a potent sharp edge. And it gets the same Xeris purple glaze for the glowing effects that the head and thrusters got. With the glow effects and edge highlighting finished, as I mentioned earlier, it's time to take another shot at applying Waterslide decals. Therefore, in order to both protect the paint and provide a better surface to apply those slippery boys, I'm giving everything a gloss top coat. I haven't applied any of these since I customized the Real Grade High New over 2 years ago. Don't worry, I'm making sure I'm pronouncing it right this time and not saying Waterslide Decals. Much like the kitbashed nature of this model, I'm using a variety of decals that have been collecting in my supplies for a while that I think go together well enough, with the main constraining factors being that I don't want to use any obvious logos or symbols, like the Tekadon symbol, and only to cut out yellow, gray, and white designs. I'll admit that water slides are one area of the modeling craft that I'm not as practiced in, but I've said before that it's important to get out of your comfort zone, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. It's definitely frustrating and difficult at first, but it often becomes quite refreshing to try something a little different once you get over the initial discomfort. With all that said though, I did not have the easiest time applying these, and my technique could use some work. The frequent adjustments I was making to get the decal in the right spot resulted in some paint being damaged in a few places, and also a few designs that were slightly misaligned or damaged. I was definitely a little disheartened at first, but there had also been a part of me considering doing some weathering on this project in the back of my mind throughout the painting process, so that seemed like the best and easiest way to deal with the subpar decal application. Since last year, I've been enjoying the often mecha-themed model painting that goes on over at Country Fried Minis, so I took some notes on sponge weathering from their Bullshit Corner 2.0 and gathered some supplies of my own. Definitely check out their channel for some entertaining and quality painting content. I know it's easy to overdo it with the weathering, but I needed to make sure my mistakes from the Waterslide decal stage were adequately covered up, and to do this I grabbed 2 metallic paints. Continuing with the janky leftovers aspect of this project, The first paint I used is a custom dark iron mix that gets dabbed onto the areas that need concealing, as well as any other areas that it would make sense to have wear, tear, and battle damage. Then I go back to the old school mithril silver, grab a tiny haggard brush, and deftly stipple more weathering on top of the dark iron areas, aiming to leave enough dark iron around the edges of the weathering. With both the decals and the weathering in these final stages of the project, my mind definitely had a few thoughts along the lines of, oh no, I ruined it, and briefly flashing back to the Sengoku ashtray. Disgusting! But I did my best to remain confident and see the process through to the end, and the final result I am more than pleased with. So with that, it's time to protect all the work with my standard 2 coats of matte varnish. I'm really glad that I decided to get out of my comfort zone and once again have my errors during the process lead to an end result that was more interesting than what I had originally planned. It's almost poetic. With the majority of my custom gunpla looking pristine, these iron-blooded leftovers will no doubt stand out among the rest of my tabletop-capable models. I actually did a casual survey with my patrons to see what style of builds they prefer, and it seems like the majority prefer to see weathered mecha, perhaps because it better simulates what they may look like as a real-life object, as Iron Elemental here describes. As I mentioned before, you can greatly help my endeavors by supporting me there, but if preferred, you can also contribute with a YouTube super thanks or donation to my Ko-Fi page. All great ways to support, ask a question, or get my attention. Find the relevant links and support methods listed in the description below. Thank you for watching this far in the video. I'd appreciate if you like, subscribe, and share if you enjoyed it. And please leave a comment with any thoughts or questions. Following my social media pages is also much appreciated. If you haven't figured out the color scheme by now, I based it off the non-binary flag. And I messed up just like I did with the flag-based colors to the Wing Zero Kitbash in 2021 because...
Pride Month was in June, Liam. Wow.
That's right. Give me some of those they-them pronouns.
Forbidden cornflakes.
The only thing that the iron-blooded leftovers care about is... That was not a good burp.